Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. Happy Friday. I hope you've had a fantastic week. It's been a great week for me in many, many ways. Um, I've been doing some research this week into what's known as the Little Apocalypse. It's one of my very favorite Old Testament um, passages. That's Isaiah 24 through 27. Some include chapter 28, even into chapter 29, but primarily chapters 27 or 24 to 27. Pardon me. And I'm doing that in response to an article by a scholar by the name of Elton Holland. I consider him a friend, even though we've never met personally. We've corresponded. Very gracious individual, a well recognized scholar, very erudite. And he recently wrote an article on the false logic, as he calls it, I think that's the term, of the full preterist view. And he defends a futurist perspective of the Olivet Discourse. So I'm in the process of researching and writing in response to Dr. Holland's very erudite scholarly article. And just having a ball. I don't know when my article is going to be done because I just keep finding stuff. But anyway, it's been a great week for me. Hope it's been a great week for you. Well, this is video number 42 in our continuing but drawing to a close review and response to the book Why Not Full Preterism by Steve Gregg. We have covered an awful lot of territory in our review of Steve's book, and we have come to the point where we are examining his closing arguments, his closing thoughts, kind of summarizing things. Okay, we're summarizing by responding to his summaries. Okay, now last week I shared with you how on page 347, and again, that's video number 41, Steve said that, well, full preterists, Don Preston especially, argue that eschatology is the fulfillment of Israel's feast days. And let me remind you of what he says, all right? Don Preston often refers to Israel's festal calendar as the context for the New Testament teaching concerning the consummation of the ages. He sees AD 70 as fulfilling the last of the feasts of the Lord, so that nothing of significance is left to happen beyond that day. Well, I've recently written a book, Resurrection Feast Fulfilled, which is about the last of Israel's feast days being a foreshadowing of the resurrection of the dead. And yes, I absolutely do hold, I teach, and I will defend the idea that Israel's feast days foreshadowed the eschatological consummation. But Steve tries to set forth the concept of two eschatological hopes. He says the Bible recognizes Israel as uniquely significant for only about a millennium and a half, from 1400 BC to 30 AD. That's a very small slice of history, representing only a quarter of the 6,000 years since Adam. Important promises, judgments, vindication of the righteous, and other history occurred in the 2,500 years prior to Israel's covenant status, as well as the 2,000 years since the abolition of Israel. And then he says, it's certainly possible that, this page 348. Don says everything has to fit into Israel's festal calendar, but maybe only everything to do with Israel has to fit into that calendar. The festivals in the calendar, after all, were part of Torah. The passing of Torah might be the end of Israel's significant history as foreshadowed in holy festivals, without the slightest hint of it being the end of God's significant dealings with the world and humanity. Ladies and gentlemen, let me reiterate what I said last week. This is the creation of two eschatological hopes. Israel, therefore, had an eschatological hope of the judgment, the coming of the Lord, the resurrection as foreshadowed in her feast days commanded in Torah. Steve says, okay, Israel's promises could be fulfilled as foreshadowed in the feast days. However, that doesn't mean there's not another eschatology up at the end of the current age. But folks, Paul said there's one hope. And why is it that if there is an eschatology divorced from Israel, separate from Israel, distinct from Israel, independent of Israel, why was Paul's doctrine of the resurrection taken from the Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel? You see, Steve never really truly addresses that, except to try to argue that some of those Old Testament prophecies of the resurrection, pardon me, while they're found in the Old Testament, they didn't really belong to Israel. No, they were independent, parenthetical, prophetic insertions into Old Testament passages that had nothing to do with the hope of Israel. Well, as I shared with you last week, that is blatantly, patently, undeniably, irrefutably false. There is no resurrection hope separate and apart from, independent from, different from God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. Even one of Paul or Steve's favorite passages for the resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15, as well as Romans chapter 8, they quote God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel, and specifically Old Covenant Israel after the flesh. It was Old Covenant Israel after the flesh that the promise concerning the adoption, i.e., the redemption of the body, Romans 8:23, it was Israel after the flesh that had that promise. Those promises were not given to the church independent of Israel. Now, it's important. I just had to go back over this territory because this is really a fatal blunder, a fatal error on the part of my friend Steve Gregg. And he continues on that fatal path in his eschatology. On page 348, in summary argument number 3, he says that preterists teach, quote, Paul's resurrection doctrine was limited to that found in Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, i.e., AD 70. And he summarizes the full preterist argument like this. Where did Jesus and Paul get their doctrine of the resurrection of the just and the unjust? Jesus came to confirm the promises made to the fathers, and Paul was preaching what the law and the prophets said would come. Daniel 12:2 predicts the resurrection anticipated in the Old Testament, and it's referring to AD 70. Now, folks, I've got to admit, the very first time I read Steve's claim, that preterist claim that Paul's resurrection doctrine was limited to that found in Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, I literally could not believe what I was reading. I do not know of a single preterist. I've never read a full preterist. I have certainly never said that Paul's resurrection doctrine was limited to Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. Never. And no preterist that I have ever heard of or read about. So for Steve to make the argument, and it's right there, in which he is claiming that Paul's resurrection is the source of Paul's resurrection doctrine is limited to Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, only Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. This is stunningly bad. I'm sorry. And again, as I've said, I mean absolutely no disrespect to Steve. He's a great guy, very, very congenial, very friendly. This is a gross misrepresentation of preterists, and certainly of me. Now, I want you to notice something, though. He takes note that preterists say Where did Jesus and Paul get their doctrine of the resurrection of the just and the unjust? And then he begins to limit his claim about what preterists believe to just Paul. Well, let me ask you a question. Where did Jesus get his doctrine of the resurrection of the just and of the unjust? There is only one Old Testament prophecy that foretold specifically the resurrection of the just and the unjust, and that's Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. You see, John chapter 5, 28 and 29, do not marvel at this, that is, that the hour had come for the resurrection of John 5, 24 through 27. Do not marvel at this, for the hour is coming in which all those who are in the grave shall come forth, some to everlasting life, some to everlasting condemnation. That's Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, as virtually all scholars agree. Now, don't forget the irony. Throughout his book, Steve castigates preterists for rejecting church history. He condemns full preterists for rejecting scholarship. And yet, you got to catch the power of this. When it comes to Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, and Steve never denies that Paul draws on Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. He never denies that Jesus drew on Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. He simply makes the false claim that preterists say that Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 is the only passage in the Old Testament for Paul's doctrine of the resurrection. Well, listen, if Jesus drew on Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, to speak about the resurrection of the just and the unjust in John chapter 5, 28 and 29, which virtually all scholars agree with, okay? It's amazing, therefore, that Steve himself rejects tradition, rejects the early church writers, rejects scholarship, because guess what? I agree that Daniel 12 is most likely discussing the events of AD 70. However, he says this is hardly an uncontroversial opinion. Well, that's right, but you take it as speaking of AD 70, and yet 99% of scholarship teaches that Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 is the final resurrection. So on the one hand, Steve castigates Christians or preterists for rejecting, quote, scholarship and tradition. But when it comes to Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, he rejects scholarship and tradition. Do you know why he does that? Because Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 emphatically teaches, or Daniel 12, I should say, emphatically teaches that this resurrection of the just and the unjust would be fulfilled, quote, when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, unquote, Daniel chapter 12, verse 7. So Steve knows very well, if he acknowledges that Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 is the final resurrection, he knows that the resurrection of Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 was to be fulfilled at the time of the destruction of Israel. Therefore, his futurism goes up in smoke. Now, the great question is, point number one, as I've already pointed out, if it's the case that Paul, in his doctrine of the resurrection, which Steve admits is the last resurrection. Oh, wait, no. Wait, remember? He says, well, yeah, Israel had an eschatological hope foreshadowed in the feast days. That could have been fulfilled in AD 70 without the real eschatology at the end of time. being in our future. I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, these are, may I use the term kindly and respectfully? This is double talk. So the great question becomes, if Paul does draw on Daniel chapter 12, which Steve applies to AD 70, then that means when we come to Acts chapter 24, 14 and 15, Paul says, I believe all things that are written in the law and the prophets, and there's about to be resurrection of the just and the unjust. Okay, wait a minute. Steve takes Acts 24:15 as end of time. Do you see a train coming? So Steve takes Acts chapter 24, verse 15, end of time, yet Acts chapter 24:15 is the resurrection of the just and the unjust. Daniel chapter 12 foretold the resurrection of the unjust when the power of the holy people would be completely shattered. Daniel chapter 12, verse 7. So the great question would become, therefore, where would Steve find another prediction of the resurrection of the just and the unjust different from Daniel chapter 12, verse 2? Where are you going to find it? Well, you see, Steve has to take the position, as he did in our formal public debate in Denver. He has to take the position that, well, you see, when Paul said, I believe all things that are written in the law and the prophets, there's about to be resurrection of the just and the unjust. Steve takes the position that Paul, point number one, was saying, I believe all things that are written in the law and the prophets. Okay, that's one thing I believe, but I also believe something different from that, something independent from that, something distinct from the law and the prophets. I believe there's going to be resurrection of the just and the unjust. Well, the problem with that, the grammar does not allow that. And point number two, Paul actually said there is about to be, from the Greek word melo, in the infinitive. So whatever the resurrection of the just and the unjust, whatever that resurrection was, however you want to define that, it was something that was imminent when Paul wrote Acts chapter 24, or when Luke wrote Acts 24, verse 15. Now, back to the distinct question. Do preterists believe that only Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, which Steve takes as AD 70, do preterists believe that Paul's resurrection doctrine is taken only and exclusively from Daniel chapter 12, verse 2? Let me reiterate what I just said. I do not know of a single preterist who has ever said that. I am unaware of any preterist at any time who has ever said that. I have never said that. I have never written that. Now, have I emphasized Daniel chapter 12? Yes, I have. Why? Well, because it's so clear. Why not use it? Does that mean that I do not know, I do not realize, and that I do not teach that there are other Old Testament prophecies of the resurrection that Paul drew on? Listen to me. You know, and again, when I read Steve's comments there, I was literally absolutely stunned. Now, mind you, he made no attempt to document that preterists rely exclusively on Daniel 12. He made no attempt to justify his claim that Paul's exclusive appeal to the resurrection doctrine in the Old Testament is Daniel 12. You see, this is a major, major mistake on Steve's part. Let me illustrate. Let's see, 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Now, let me point out a couple of things. Point number one, scholarship that Steve rejects when it comes to Daniel chapter 12. Scholarship is widely agreed that Paul is drawing on Daniel chapter 12. in 1 Corinthians 15. Point number 2, scholarship is widely agreed, and all you have to do is read Tom Holland, Brett Petrie. All you have to do is read many of the modern major scholars, and they agree. Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is drawing on Ezekiel chapter 37. Well, here's what's amazing about Ezekiel chapter 37. It provides the background for Daniel chapter 12, as is widely admitted in scholarship. Let's see, what does Ezekiel chapter 37 predict? It depicts the whole house of Israel in captivity. The whole house, all 12 tribes. Now you have to remember the 10 northern tribes were carried off by Assyria, 721 BC. 2 southern tribes carried off into Babylonian captivity in 586 BC. But you see, when Babylon destroyed Jerusalem, she had already destroyed Assyria. Therefore, the 10 northern tribes were now in Babylonian captivity. You can't delineate between those in reality. So the 10 northern tribes in captivity were assimilated into the Babylonian captivity when Babylon destroyed Assyria and overtook all of her territory. Okay? All right. So here Ezekiel 37 depicts the whole house of Israel in bondage, in captivity. But wait a minute. It depicts the whole house of Israel in the grave. You know, the valley of the dead bones. Ezekiel was asked, "Son of man, who are these bones?" "Well, I don't know. You know. They are the whole house of Israel, and they're in the graves. But the Lord promised, I will pour out my spirit, and I will raise you up out of your graves, and I will restore you." Now, as Levinson and a host of other scholars have noted, originally in the Jewish literature, the ancient Jewish literature, originally the interpretation of Ezekiel 37 among the ancients was that Ezekiel 37 had nothing whatsoever to do with biological resurrection of physically dead people. It originally spoke of the return of the whole house of Israel from captivity. But Levinson simply says, but it was changed over time. Now, he doesn't tell us why, doesn't tell us how, doesn't tell us who changed it. So here's my point. If it's the case, and I believe absolutely that it's the case, if it's the case that in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul is drawing upon, echoing Ezekiel chapter 37, okay? Then that means that Paul is not reliant exclusively on Daniel 12, doesn't it? And again, I wholeheartedly agree with scholarship on this, that Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 is echoing, drawing upon Ezekiel. But here's an amazing reality. Let me frame it like this. The resurrection of 1 Corinthians chapter 15 would be in fulfillment of the resurrection prophecy of Ezekiel chapter 37. Scholarship agrees. But the resurrection promise of Ezekiel chapter 37 was the promise not of biological or physical resurrection out of the ground of biologically dead human beings, but it was the promise of the resurrection, the deliverance out of sin, death, alienation from God under the Messiah. Therefore, the resurrection prophecy of Ezekiel 37 being one of the sources of Paul's resurrection doctrine in 1 Corinthians 15, that means that Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 was anticipating the deliverance of Israel, not out of biological death, but out of sin, death, bondage to sin, alienation from God. Thus, just like Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, Ezekiel 37 predicted AD 70. Number 3, Hosea chapter 13. Now, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 55, and 56, Paul said the resurrection would be the time when would be brought to pass, in other words, would be fulfilled, brought to pass the saying, O death, where is your victory? Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? Well, you see, the first citation is from Isaiah 25, verse 8. Now keep this in mind. In Isaiah chapter 25, Gregg agrees, verses 1 to 7, applied to the first century and the time of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Do you catch the power of that? But he comes to verse 8, which Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 55 and 56, death is swallowed up in victory. He says, oh, well, Isaiah 25:8 is a parenthetical, independent prophecy, as I pointed out, inserted between verse 7 and verse 9, with no indication from the context, no grammatical indication whatsoever, that the subject is being changed from AD 70 to the end of time. So Steve believes Isaiah 25, verse 8, being cited by Paul, has nothing to do with the context of Isaiah 25. Well, let's go to another passage. The second passage, Hosea chapter 13, verse 14. Paul's doctrine of the resurrection would be the fulfillment of Hosea chapter 13, verse 14. O grave, where is your victory? So Hosea chapter 13, verse 14 foretold the resurrection that Paul was anticipating in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Do you catch that? You follow me here? Hosea 13 foretold the resurrection that Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 was anticipating that would come at the coming of the Lord, the time of the end. Okay, so what's the death of Hosea 13? Well, it has to be physical death. Everybody knows that, right? Because Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 is talking about the resurrection of the body. That's got to be physical bodies, doesn't it? No, it does not. Follow me. The resurrection of 1 Corinthians chapter 15 would be in fulfillment of the resurrection promise of Hosea chapter 13 and verse 14. The death of Hosea chapter 13 is defined in Hosea 13, 1 and 2. When Ephraim humbled herself, he was exalted in Israel. Yet, when he sinned, he died. Who's he talking about? The corporate body of Israel that sinned. I'm not talking about biological death of individuals. When Ephraim sinned, he died. Yet he sinned more and more. How did Ephraim sin more and more? After dying? Through idolatry. That's verse 2 and 3. So just exactly like Ezekiel 37, and I would proffer, just like Daniel chapter 12, Israel as the corporate body was dead through sin. But Daniel chapter 12, Ezekiel 37, and Hosea 13 defined the death as sin death, alienation from God. Since the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 would be the fulfillment of Daniel 12, would be the fulfillment of Ezekiel 37, would be the fulfillment of Hosea 13, that means it would be the fulfillment of Isaiah 25:8. But all of these passages were prophecies of resurrection out of sin death, out of alienation from God. Not one of them had to do with physical resurrection out of the dirt. So what have I done? I have adduced, and there are more, but I have adduced 3 separate, distinct prophecies that Paul drew from for his resurrection doctrine. I have shown that in each one of these separate prophecies, and they're not independent from one another, but I have shown that in each of these separate prophecies of the resurrection, biological death is not in the context, cannot be read into the context. It is a perversion of the context to insert biological physical death into the text. Therefore, it is a perversion of 1 Corinthians chapter 15 to insert biological physical death into Paul's doctrine of the resurrection. And more specifically to our point today, this is a total, utter, absolute, irrefutable refutation of Steve Gregg's claim, that preterist claim, that the only Old Testament passage that Paul uses for his doctrine of the resurrection was Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. The claim is false, totally false. And of course, as I just demonstrated, when we look closely at those Old Testament prophecies of the resurrection, we find that there is no justification for a doctrine of physical bodies coming out of the grave at the end of time. Guess what? I'm out of time. Thanks for joining me. Hopefully, Mike and I can get back to our preterist apologetics. He was sick last week, so hopefully we'll be able to do that. So be watching for it. Thanks for joining me. God bless.